Hey there, Blazer fans, and welcome to episode 39 of the Dragon's Den, a podcast for those that bleed green and gold. Today, I have one of the legendary players from the hardwood, a UAB basketball guard from 1988 to 1991, Mr. Jack Kramer. We have a lot to get into, but one quick note, no This Week in Blazer History segment. I will look to get those started again soon, but I hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks for listening. All right, Blazer fans, I've got my guest here for episode 39 of the Dragon's Den, a former guard for the men's basketball team from 1988 to 1991, Mr. Jack Kramer. Jack, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Will. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Thanks for having me.
I'm honored. You played alongside some of the greats, and you were part of some fantastic basketball teams, and I'm really looking forward to hearing some of your stories.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it as well.
So, Jack, what are you? How are you, and what are you up to these days?
Well, you and I talked the last, couple days putting this together, preparing it. And, as we've discussed, I've got a son playing baseball at Ole Miss. I've got my other son is playing basketball at St. Louis University. My daughter is just got back from Ireland. She's a junior at the University of Missouri. I live in St. Louis. I'm married to my wife, Becky. So we're very busy in the Kramer household these days. I've got a full-time job, and I work for a company called Reynolds & Reynolds. I've been there for 26 years. And really, for the most part, I think I've been in St. Louis since 1998. I didn't grow up here, but we've made it our home. And it's a couple hours from where I grew up. So that's what I've been doing. We're busy all the time doing something with the kids.
Well, Jack, you mentioned them. I know you had to be excited, and you're super proud of your kids. Your two sons are currently D1 athletes. One, as you mentioned, is playing baseball at Ole Miss, who just won a national championship in Omaha. Did you get a chance to watch many of his games this season? And did you go to Omaha for the World Series?
Yeah, well, it was a little bit of a challenge getting down to Oxford, although we love Oxford. It's a great town. We love the square. The Ole Miss campus is gorgeous. And of course, the baseball program down there is just second to none. Their facilities are awesome. So we made it down for a few games, and not every one, because we had our son Nick, who was a senior last year. But we tried to get down as much as we could. And then, we talked about going down to Miami when they made the NCAA tournament, and then we didn't go. And then they got to the super regional, and we talked about going to Hattiesburg, and I just couldn't make that work logistically. And then they made it to Omaha, which we were so excited about. And finally, I said to my wife, I go, let's go. We're going to regret if we don't go to Omaha. And the great thing for John, he was a true freshman this year. He made the traveling team. He made the active roster of 27 players, which is kind of a big deal because, he was the only true freshman position player to make that 27-man active roster. So we're really proud of the year that he had. And then the excitement of being in Omaha and them winning the national championship. It was really a thrill. It was a thrill not only for John, and what a wonderful experience for him, but for my wife and I, because sometimes as parents, it's hard to be a fan. It's something you definitely want to work on, but you are sitting there watching your children and their performance, and if they do well, you're kind of relieved, and and if they don't do that well, you're there to try to help them, but you're kind of living and dying, with them on their success, or if they have some failures. So there's some challenges around that. But while we were at Omaha, we just got totally caught up in being Ole Miss baseball fans, and it was really exciting for my wife and I. We really had a ball. And I haven't gotten to experience that much, so it was a lot of fun.
So how did your son end up playing baseball with you being a basketball player, and how did he end up at Ole Miss?
Well, that's a great question, Will. And I played some baseball, back in high school. And I've had these conversations, and we could have a whole conversation on, should you be a 3-sport athlete? Should you just try to focus and, be a specialist and try to go D1? And I think a lot of high school, coaches and different people are like, hey, enjoy your high school experience, be a 3-sport athlete. But then there's other people are like, hey, you need to, put all your time and energy and work on becoming, a baseball player, a basketball player. And so for me, growing up in the 80s in Quincy, Illinois, I played all three sports. When it was baseball season, I went and played baseball. When it was football season, played football. When it was basketball, we played basketball. And then as I got to be like a junior and senior, and you could kind of see that I was going to pan out as a basketball player, then I kind of dialed that in and focused on that. But when I had children, I always said, I wish if I would have put as much time and energy into baseball as I did into basketball, it was some of it was around athleticism, but so that was kind of the beginning of the kids. When they're younger, I was like, and then St. Louis with the Cardinals, it's a little bit of a baseball town. And, when the kids were young, all of a sudden, they're doing a lot of baseball, right? Mm-hmm. And John, my son that's at Ole Miss, he just really took to it. He loved it. He'd get hit by a pitch and it didn't even affect him. And he could just hit from day one, where my other son, Nick, he didn't really take to it. He liked the social component. He liked being with his friends. He liked having fun, but he wasn't really crazy about baseball. So it was kind of funny how, 10 years later or whatever it's been, John is 6'1", 230, and his build, he's really designed for baseball, right? And then Nick is 6'4", 205. He's longer, he's lankier, has a 38-inch vertical. So he's more designed for basketball. So it kind of worked out, but that's how, we got John into baseball early. And of course he played basketball and he played baseball, but basketball and football, but baseball was his true love. And he just took off with it, and he had success and he loved it and he was built for it. So it was kind of the perfect combination, right? He loved the sport, he was good at it, and his body was designed for it. And then the interesting story, the second part of your question was, how did he end up at Ole Miss, right? Well, I'm sure you are a big fan, as I am, of UAB basketball and our coach, Andy Kennedy, which I just think that's great that he's leading our program. And of course, I played with Andy at UAB back in the day. And of course, Andy and I were friends when we played, and teammates and backcourt mates. And our friendship has sustained itself over the years, of course. And when Andy was at Ole Miss, we would go down and visit, right? Like, hey, Andy, what are you guys doing? Oh, we got a game over Christmas. You guys should come down. And the kids were like, 9 or 10 years old, 11 years old. And they were like ball boys, right? The boys, even if the kids would sit on the bench, they'd rebound for the team. The boys got to go in the locker room. It was just a wonderful experience. And we just became Ole Miss fans. It was crazy. Like, it started off like, when is Ole Miss basketball on TV, right? That's who we followed. But then it was like, we started becoming Ole Miss football fans, right? And then Ole Miss baseball fans. So then John at 12 said, Dad, I want to go to the camp. And he went to the camp at 12, and he met Coach Bianco, and he met the coaching staff. And I mean, the kid was just like, that. This is where I'm going to school, right? Mm-hmm. I'm like, okay, well, you might want to have a backup plan because they're pretty good down there, Yeah. So he loved it, and he was progressing as a player. And about his freshman year, I called Andy. It was like the fall of John's freshman year. And I said, hey, I heard there's this thing called a Super 100 camp, but it's not really for freshmen. It's kind of for sophomores and juniors. I don't know if you have any connections down there, if you know anybody, but if you could, kind of reach out to the coaches and see if you could help me get John into this camp. So of course, Andy, and that's one of the things I love about Andy and our friendship, he's just, we might go a year not talking on the phone, but if I call, he answers or gets back in touch, and then anything he could do to help, right? Like, and I just love that about him, and he's like, hey, let me see what I can do. I'll get back with you. So he hangs up, he calls Carl Lafferty, who's the assistant coach, recruiting coordinator, and Andy and Carl are kind of buddies, right? And of course, Andy knows Bianco too. They're friends, but he's got a better relationship with Lafferty. And Andy, 5 minutes later, he calls back and he goes, listen, you can get in the camp. You got to do this. Go online. You're going to fill it out. They're going to send you some stuff. You got to pay because everybody has to pay for this camp. But it's kind of a little bit of the, high level camp where they're really evaluating kids. And John's in. I couldn't believe it. I'm like, I've been thinking about how the heck can I get into this camp for John for months, right? I make one phone call to Andy and we're in. So we get down there and it was a few weeks later and Andy's like, hey, when you get in town, give me a call, get situated, let me know where you're at and I'll come over and watch, right? So what I love about that is we get there, and of course, Andy's a celebrity, right? Like, I mean, people in Oxford know him. He's recognizable. They loved him, Yeah. So I'm up in the stands. There's, hundreds of kids out at this camp, this camp or whatever you want to call it. And they're playing an inter squad game, and John's out on the field. And Andy walks in, he's like, how the heck do you know who's good, right? And then he's like, is your kid any good? And I'm like, as a dad, you definitely love your kids, but you don't want to be that dad, right? Oh, my kid's the best, So I'm like, I think he's good, Andy, but heck, I don't know, we'll see. So the first at bat, he walks, right? And Andy's fidgety and he's like, been there 20 minutes. He's like, man, how do you do this? Like, I can't even tell who's good out there. Like, this is so slow. And he's like, if I go to a basketball, man, I know who's good. Well, right about that time, Will, John gets up and boom, hits a home run. And Andy and I are up in the stands. There's probably 300 or 400 people in the stands. We're high-fiving and hugging each other. He's like, dude, that is so great. So Andy's like texting Lafferty right there. Like, hey, you guys got to offer this kid, So and then Coach Bianco waves at Andy and says hello to her, in the stands, like, hey, Andy, And then Andy leaves. And then that night, that was like a Saturday night, Andy's out with Lafferty. So they're negotiating. Andy's like, dude, you got to. So Andy's acting like, he's on the other side. Usually he's the coach recruiting the kid. Now he's the, friend trying to help, get John landed at Ole Miss. Well, Ole Miss is like, hey, we're not going to offer a freshman, like we just saw him one time. He looks pretty good, but we're not going to offer him. So the next day was Sunday, and Coach Bianco, there's 100 kids at this camp, 200 or 300 people in the stands. And because of Andy, right, Coach Bianco waves John and I down, and he's busy, right? And he's a big time guy, right? I mean, that's a top 20 program. Yeah. And because of Andy, he pulls John and I aside. He spends 20 minutes with us, Will. And he says, look, and this is what I love. I love this story. He said, Jack, and to John, he goes, guys, he said, I've been doing this for 20 years, right? At that time, he's been a coach 25 years. And he goes, do you know how many coaches, administrators, friends, grandparents, like, do you know how many people have said to me, you got to look at my grandson. You got to look at my nephew. You got to look at my friend's kid. And John and I go, no. And he goes, thousands. And he goes, do you know how many I've recruited? Oh, no, I'm sorry. He said, do you know how many I've looked at? And we're like, no. And he's like, 1,000. He goes, I have looked at every single kid. I have never said, busy. If somebody said, take a look at this kid, I looked at him. Every time. 1,000 kids were referred to me, and I've looked at 1,000 from, administrators at Ole Miss or whatever.
Yeah.
And he goes, do you know how many I've recruited? To John and I. And we go, no. He goes, John Kramer's the first one. He goes, I've looked at 1,000 kids, and 1,000 weren't good enough to be recruited at Ole Miss. And he goes, but your son is good enough to be recruited by our school. And he said, but I'm not going to commit you today. Like, I got to watch you some more, which was great, which is part of why we love Ole Miss and Coach Bianco is he's consistent. He's an honest man. He, runs a great program. We trust him. We respect him. We like him. And then, of course, he kept recruiting John. And then eventually about the next summer, he offered him. And of course, Lafferty called up John and said, hey, John, we're going to offer you. John said, I'll take it. And then Coach Lafferty laughed and said, well, hold on, John, you're kind of, you're kind of taking the negotiations away from your dad, because in baseball, there's not full scholarships like in basketball and football. There's 11.7 scholarships for 25 guys. So there's no such thing as a full scholarship. Everybody's on a partial. And if anybody tells you they're getting set, even 80%, they're lying. It's just, there's just not enough money to go around, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of a problem with baseball, but it is what it is. Anyway, long story short, John was so excited. That was his dream school. I mean, he would have went there no matter what. Of course, Coach B, it was more than fair that, what they gave John, and they just lived up to everything that they said they would do, so we couldn't be happier. And he's had a wonderful experience down there. So that's been a really good as a parent, because, that's hard. You never know, what the culture is going to be like, right?
Yeah.
Like, as a fan, you know what conference they're in, you know what their record is, what the school looks like, what the campus looks like, but you don't really know what that culture truly is like until you get immersed in it, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's a pretty good culture at Ole Miss. So we're proud of John. We're happy for him. So yeah, so that's that story, and we enjoyed it.
Well, that's fantastic. Your other son, as you mentioned, is a talented basketball player that committed to St. Louis. You're from Quincy, Illinois, as you mentioned. You went to Quincy High School. You were recruited out of high school, and you went to Michigan. Walk my listeners through the recruitment, through your recruitment, and how it's the same or how it's different from your son's recruitment now.
Well, it's interesting, Will. When you look at 1980s versus 2022, and the world has changed a lot, right?
Oh yeah.
It's changed in football, baseball, basketball, all sports. The SEC, is just a completely different environment than it was. You guys are down there. UAB, I mean, if you look at the UAB campus, it's so different today than what it was, 30 and 40 years ago. But I did come from Quincy, Illinois, had a rich tradition of basketball. I was lucky to have played for a legend. His name was Jerry Leggett. And now the program was built before he got there. He inherited a great program that was in great shape. A guy named Cheryl Hanks kind of built the program, but then Coach Leggett not only kept it going, in my opinion, but kind of achieved some heights that were unprecedented. And he won, state championships, national championships. Kids were going to Iowa and Illinois and Michigan and Kansas. He was really producing a lot of kids. The tenet of his program was discipline, organization, and fan support. We had 5,000, season ticket holders in high school. It's just unbelievable. And so I grew up in a great program, lots of discipline, lots of organization, lots of success. And it was just kind of a factory, right? You went through that system, you went D1. So that, that process, and then going through the process of getting recruited, I was a 4-star. There was a recent thing on Twitter that came out that had like the top 50. So it had Andy Kennedy was 31st, I believe. Larry Rimbert was in the 20s. He was a McDonald's All-American. Obviously, Andy was a McDonald's All-American, but I don't think he got to go to the game, which was a great honor for both those guys and deserved, of course. I was a little higher up on that. I was, I think, in the 80s, like 88 or 89, somewhere in there, which kind of puts you up into what is a 4-star. But, I took visits to Michigan, Michigan State, Missouri. I had offers from Indiana and Iowa State and, different schools around the whole country, really.
Yeah.
And that was the recruiting process that I went through. And the world was different back then. You asked to compare and contrast to what Nick did. But back then there was not really AAU basketball, right? There wasn't the Nike series like there is today, or the Adidas series. You went to camps, right? So if you wanted to get evaluated, they'd invite you to these camps, and then they'd put you on teams and guys would play and the college coaches would come and watch. So the camps somewhat exist, but not even close to what they were back in the day. But really what dominates the recruiting scene today is the Nike circuit. There's about 45 teams, and it's really difficult to make those teams. But if you make those teams, your chances of going D1 are much greater. So again, here comes Andy Kennedy, of course, my friend, and then other guys, that I played for, which I love, that relationship, not only with Andy, but like guys like Dylan Howard. So Nick's kind of growing up. He's doing the basketball thing. And, I might work in the backyard, put together a little highlight video, send it to Andy in 8th grade. What do you think? And Andy or Dylan Howard would say, hey, that looks good, but he needs to pick up his pace, or hey, work on some shot fakes, work on some pass fakes. So the recruitment of Nick, what was kind of unique about that was he was maybe not a kid. He was like 5'4" in 8th grade, right? And then 6 foot at 8th or 9th grade. We're like, okay, he grew, but he still wasn't there, right? There wasn't enough athleticism. But his whole recruiting story is unique, and it ties into Andy. And again, back to UAB, which I love. Andy's like, hey, anything I can do to help your son, let me get the word out a little bit. So I'd kind of send the videos when he was a freshman and sophomore. To be honest, Andy was being nice, but he was like, I don't think he's good enough, right? I mean, in fairness, he didn't say it quite like that, but, he's like, yeah, he's nice. But we weren't making those EYBL teams, So Nick's freshman year, he broke his arm and he didn't make the Bradley Beal Elite, which is the local team. And he had to go to a tier 2 team, right? Which was fine. It was Adidas circuit, which is a good circuit, but it just wasn't as high level as the EYBL circuit. And so, but, then the next year was COVID. So the COVID killed everything. And Nick, had actually made an EYBL team, but COVID came along. But what was great about Andy was like, he was constantly like, hey, Nick needs to pick up his pace. Nick needs to work on his release getting quicker. Really the things that just what you need to hear, really, to be honest with you, right? And he just always kept it real, And then it was funny behind the scenes, Sydney Ball, who's an assistant at UAB and played there, Andy would take the videos from Nick over to Sydney, hey, what do you think? Can Jack's kid play? That looks good. So Andy's like, man, I need to see him in person, but COVID was kicking everything out. And then the next year, which was going into his senior year, and Andy was constantly like, hey, Jack, you got to get on that EYBL circuit. If you make it to the EYBL circuit for Nick, that makes you recruitable for D1, right? And so anyway, long story short, he finally makes the Bradley Beal Elite team. He's 6'4", he's 205. He's really worked on his game. He's jumping up, he's dunking the basketball. And Nick put all that work in. And Andy's like, you know what? Hey, he's D1. I'm like, we show him highlights of what he's doing. So then it went from, I'll help you to, hey, your kid's pretty good. Now, we already had an offer from Alabama A&M from Dylan Howard. And Dylan did all the same things too. I'm giving Andy kind of the credit, but Dylan was identical. Dylan's like, what can I do to help Nick? Let me reach out to other coaches. And, that's pretty special, really, that guys like that, right? Those are 30, 40-year relationships. And those guys are just wonderful. And so then the thing with Andy was fun was kind of like, hey, he's D1. I'll talk to some other coaches. He's D1. Hey, we want him. Like, we're going to offer him. Get him down here for a visit. That was fun. And then the last piece was, holy smokes. Like, Nick was scoring like 21 points. He was our third leading scorer. Our team on the EYBL circuit finished second in the nation. It was pretty exciting. The last couple games were on ESPN. Nick, I think, had 13 points in the semifinal game, and it was pretty exciting. And but through the recruiting process, SLU got involved with Travis Ford. He's a great recruiter. And then Nick's high school coach is a guy named Erwin Claggett. And Erwin played at SLU. He's an All-American. I think he's their all-time leading scorer, scored 2,000 points. A great coach and a great friend to Nick. Like, those two love each other. Like, Nick played for him for 4 years. Those two have a wonderful relationship. And I think between Travis Ford and Erwin Claggett and Nick Kramer, they were all meeting in secret. And then one day they're like, Dad, I'm going to SLU. And we think it was a wonderful choice for Nick. And it really had no bearing, nothing negative on Andy and UAB, of course. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But it was the right process and the right decision for Nick. And he's really excited. So he's on campus at SLU. It's different than when I played. They can practice, within the limits of what the NCAA allows. They get workouts, they lift weights. So it's a lot more structured than back in our day. I think we were playing in the Birmingham Summer League, which, by the way, was a great summer league, with guys like Charles Barkley and Will Person. It was a great summer league. All the guys from Auburn, Alabama, UAB, all the NBA guys. It was probably one of the best summer leagues in the nation, to be honest with you. But they do it different today, which in a lot of ways is better. So that's Nick's recruitment. We were excited about that. And we're pretty fortunate. I always kind of joke around and say I have 3 D1 kids. I'm leaving Emma out, but she's my oldest daughter. She got a 3300 ACT. She's on a full ride at the University of Missouri. She's a biology major, pre-med. She wants to go to medical school. So I always joke around. I got a D1 academic daughter. I got a D1 baseball player, and I got a D1 basketball player. So we're pretty fortunate. But they put in a lot of hard work, and Mom and I, my wife and I mean, it's a huge commitment, a 10-year commitment, but it was worth it, I guess. So
that's great. Well, Jack, you brought it up. Nick was recruited by UAB and Andy Kennedy. That had to be exciting. Tell us about that experience for both you and Nick.
Well, okay. So first of all, it was okay. You got to understand, Andy Kennedy with my boys, and it's a credit to Andy. He's like the cool uncle, right? Like there was a picture on social media the other day with Andy and Charles Barkley. I don't know if you saw it or not,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
But I mean, and then Nick sees it on social media and he calls me. He's like, Dad, did you see that picture with Andy and Charles Barkley? I'm like, yeah, Dad, Andy is badass. I mean, Dad, Andy is so cool, right? Like my kids love him. You know what I'm saying? And then like when they're younger, he'd give them $100 bill, they're like, and I'm like, Andy, don't give them that. You don't have to do that, or, shirts or he just was the cool uncle. Right. Mm-hmm. And then he's down at Oxford, Mississippi. I don't know. He was down there over the winter. And like, I get a text from Andy and John. It was probably after the basketball season, to be honest, but Andy was in Oxford partying, I guess. And like, I get a text from both of them, like, right. With pictures, like, I get a picture from John of him and Andy, and then I get an Andy text from him like, hey, I'm hanging out with your kid, But so you got to understand, my kids love Andy. Does that make sense? And they have a personal relationship with him, and I love that, So it started off with, hey, I'm going to help you. Well, then Nick is really playing well on this EYBL circuit, right? Mm-hmm. And we had great players on this team. Nick Smith, who's the #1 ranked player in the country, going to Arkansas. Brandon Miller, #8 player in the country, going to Alabama, And Nick was the 3rd leading scorer on this team, and we finished 2nd. 45 teams are fighting to win, the EYBL Peach Jam National Championship. And we lost by 3 points. We had a chance to win it at the buzzer, right? So it was pretty exciting, Mm-hmm. And Nick was the 3rd leading scorer on the team. I think he averaged like 9 points at Peach Jam. He was a shooter. That was his role on that team, and a scorer, more of a shooter than a scorer. We can talk a little bit about that. But so the process was, Nick started getting recruited at a pretty good level because guys were watching Nick Smith and Brandon Miller, and they're like, who the heck is this number 12? Holy smokes, that kid can really play. He can shoot it. So Nick's stock went straight up, right? Because mm-hmm. of COVID, he was an unknown quantity. And at 15U, he didn't make an EYBL team. So 15U, he's not known, right? Mm-hmm. 16U, he's not known because it was COVID. And now all of a sudden, 7, they're like, where is this kid coming from? They think it's this, he just popped onto the scene, and in a way he did, and then people are tuning in to watch Nick Smith. So schools that are recruiting Nick Smith, coaches like Ole Miss and different schools around the country, are calling Nick Smith, and Nick's from Arkansas. He's staying at our house when he's up in St. Louis practicing or whatever. So Nick is staying at our house. Nick's on the phone with these college coaches, and they're like, who's this? So Nick Smith is saying, this is Nick Kramer. He's tough. You guys got to start recruiting him. Well, then all of a sudden Nick's stock went up and schools start recruiting him. So I'm on the phone with Andy. I'm like, dude, his stock is going up, Mm-hmm. And the same with Dylan. I don't want to leave Dylan out because Dylan Howard was equal in that same process. And so Andy's like, I'm going to offer him. And I'm like, okay. He goes, I'm going to call Nick. Here you go. So Andy goes, but I don't like to offer until I get to see him in person, right? Well, this is back in like April and May. And he didn't have a chance to see him in person because of COVID.
Yeah.
Still hadn't released the coaches to go watch kids in person yet, which really hurt the recruiting, right? Mm-hmm. So anyway, that was fun. So Andy is on the phone with Nick, and the two of them are talking. It was great. And then, so that was pretty cool. But from a personal standpoint, it's wonderful to have the relationship with Andy. It's wonderful at UAB. It's a great school, be a great place for Nick. There's nothing negative, right?
Yeah.
Other than you want your kids to kind of forge their own path, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you want, like just like John, he's good. He's doing his baseball thing. He's forging his own path, right? Emma is at Mizzou. That was her school. She picked it. I had nothing to do with Mizzou. I never gone, right? She's in the medical. She's going to go into that field. I wanted the same thing for Nick. Does that make sense? Like, I didn't want it to be like, oh, well, Jack's buddies with Andy Kennedy, so Nick Kramer's going to go to UAB.
Yeah.
That was one part. And Andy respected that. He knew that. The other piece was my relationship with Andy is a friendship that goes back to 1987. We are peers. We are friends. We are teammates. We are backcourt. We have a lot of great history. Well, guess what? Your kid goes to play for Andy, and immediately that changes, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so, not that I'm, I wasn't completely afraid of it, but part of me, that was in the back of my mind a little bit, right? So, so nothing negative, just wanting to make sure that it was the right fit for Nick. And then I wanted it to be Nick's decision, not mine. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
So it really all worked out great. And it was funny, UAB came up and played Sulu this year, and UAB beat him, and I had to be careful, I have to be careful with Andy. We can't interact like we used to, right? Because, you never know what the future holds for anybody or anything. In fact, we have a UAB, former UAB player who's an assistant coach at SLU, Will Bailey, right?
Oh, yeah.
Will played for Murray Bartow back in the day. So he's like one of Nick's coaches. So it just couldn't have worked out better. But you asked specifically about that process. And then Nick it was in June and before, we had scheduled to go down and make a campus visit in July down at UAB, and Nick committed to SLU, and it all worked out. So that was the UAB recruitment with Andy Kennedy, but it was a lot of fun.
So back to your time as a player, you decided to leave Michigan after your freshman year and transfer. A couple of questions. Why did you decide to transfer, and how do you think transferring was different back then compared to the transfer portal today? And how did you end up at UAB?
Well, it's interesting, Will, because back in 1986, I don't know how many kids transferred, but I'll bet you it was around 100 if I had to guess, It certainly wasn't 2,000, right? Yeah. In 2022, there's 2,000 kids in the transfer portal. So you can say why. What are the differences between 1986 and 2022? So we could spend some time comparing that, right? Like, and then when you look at why did Jack Kramer transfer from Michigan? Well, if you would have asked me that question in 1987, I might have given you a different answer than I'm giving you today at 55 years old.
Yeah.
And I've had some, obviously some experience, and then going through it with my kids has kind of helped too. But I'll be honest with you, in 1986 to maybe 2000, like I kind of felt like a little bit of a failure, to be honest with you. I felt like I went to Michigan, I spent a lot of time getting recruited, I did lots of research and work, and I get up there to Michigan and it didn't work out for me, right? And there's some of it's on me, maybe a lot of it's on me. Like, I think there was a level of immaturity. I think that as much as I wanted to think I was completely prepared for, being 10 hours away from home, and, that was a pretty big time program, and lots of things that go on with being away from home for the first time, and all the pressures and the stress of playing college basketball. I certainly could have handled a lot of things better, for sure. But there were some other things, guys, you looked at that list, that top 50 list that came out with Andy's name on it. Well, number one was Derek Coleman, who went to Syracuse, who we played them, by the way, that year at Michigan. We beat them, and then they finished second in the NCAA tournament. That was kind of interesting. Then the next name down was Terry Mills, who came into Michigan with me, and he was a prop 48. So he had to sit out, which is a whole different thing. And then the fourth name on that list, Jared Reed was the third name, I think, and he went to North Carolina, and we played him at Michigan and North Carolina. I have a picture of me and Jared Reed, and I got in that game. And then the next name was Ramil Robinson, and Ramil Robinson was out of Boston, and he came to Michigan. Well, I had committed in the fall, and they signed Ramil in the spring. Well, so the reality is for me. Okay, Ramil Robinson is the fourth ranked player in the country, and he spent probably 8 years in the NBA. He's a pretty good player, right? Mm-hmm. So he's a point guard. And then the two guard, I don't know if you've heard of this name or not, but a guy named Glenn Rice. He's 6'8", all-time lead scorer of the NCAA tournament, 15 years in the NBA. He's got a high school state championship. He's got a college national championship, and he's got an NBA world championship. He's a pretty good player. So, I'm like, okay, I want to play. Right? Like I haven't spent the last 10 years of my life to be, a 2 or 3 minute a game guy at the end of the first half, backing up Ramil, making sure he doesn't get his third foul. And then, oh, by the way, Jack will dribble the ball and make his free throws. So we'll bring him in the last 3 minutes. That wasn't the role I wanted. Right.
Yeah.
So ultimately that's the bottom line. I was like, okay, hey, I want to go see if there's a better place for me. And I think if you got 2,000 kids in the transfer portal, I think a lot of those kids are like that, right? Mm-hmm. Like, hey, and today it's almost crazy. I mean, you look at a kid like Jelly Walker, here's a kid, he was at New Orleans, comes to UAB, but he found the right fit, right? And you even look at Andy. Andy was at North Carolina. Andy's a 5-star, right? He's the 31 ranked kid, but he gets up there to North Carolina with, Balvano, and they're pretty good players up there too. And I'll just say this about Andy. He comes in there to UAB that summer in '87. We're down there working out. And, you look at that list, like you got Rembert, you got Kennedy, they're top 50s. You had a kid that nobody probably has ever heard of at UAB, but Marcus Broadnax was on that list as an honorable mention. He was on campus and was great. I mean, that guy could pass like unbelievable. And then you got Alan Ogg, who was a top 100. I was a top 100. Barry Bearden was really good. So that you think about going and playing pickup basketball, it was amazing. And Reginald Turner, who's 6'8", 240, could dunk. Dylan Howard was a transfer, or no, he came in straight, but he was a great player. There was so much talent there. I remember calling my dad saying, oh my God, like I was shocked by the level of athleticism and talent at Michigan. And I said to my dad, I go, I'm going to be honest with you, there's not much drop off here at UAB. And there wasn't. There was a lot of talent on that campus. So, and back on Andy, that guy, you could hardly guard him back in those days. I'd never really met anybody that was shooting 22-foot, 23-foot NBA threes. But with Andy, if you got up on him, he had an incredible quick first step. And he was 6'8", and he could jump up like a pogo stick and dunk, right? Mm-hmm. And that was before he hurt his knee. So UAB really didn't see what he was capable of because he hurt his knee before the first game of his sophomore year, right? And the anterior cruciate ligament ACL surgery in 1987 is not the same as it is today, right? Like he had the surgery, but he just was never the same. He's still great, but he could have been much, much better. So that's the thing. I'll give you another story. This is not related to UAB, but look at, I was just thinking about him the other day because my kids kind of know him. Jamison Williams, who went to Ohio State. He's from Carter Ritter. He goes to Ohio State. He didn't play. He was the most athletic guy on the football field for Alabama. Think about that. Think about how many 5-star guys Alabama football has. And Jameis Williams goes to Ohio State and doesn't play. So the transfer portal, and that's another thing that's different. Back in my day, you transferred, you had to sit out a year, and the coach could basically say whether you could transfer or not permanently. He could say, nope, Jack can't go to UAB. He had that ability. And some coaches did it. So the transfer portal, so the way the portal works, the kid gets to put his name in And then the school has 48 hours to say what if they have a problem with this kid. But they can't just say I have a problem with this kid because I don't like him,
Yeah.
right? They have to put something in there. He did something academically, did something, right? Which 99% of the time there's no issue, right? You go in the portal, and that's the difference. It's really shifted the dynamic where the coaches and the universities had a lot of control before, right? That's why kids didn't transfer as much. It's harder, but they've made it a lot easier to shift for the kids. I think there's probably some balance as to what is the right way, and I think we'll maybe balance out a little bit here in the end. But I love what Andy's doing. I'm worried about the recruitment of high school kids. I think there's some challenges. We could talk about that. But I think Andy is smart to embrace it. That 5-star or 4-star kid that he might not be able to get out of high school, once that kid's been on campus a year or two on an SEC type school and he's not getting to play as much as he wants, I think he's got another crack at that kid. And that kid really can showcase his talent. If you're the 6th man or even the 5th man, right, on a SEC team, you're probably not going to the NBA. But if you're the best player at UAB, you can go to the NBA.
Yeah.
So you need to showcase your talent. And that's really smart. What Andy's doing is why he's having so much success.
Your first season, you broke the record for most assists in a single season by a Blazer with 199, and you shot well from three, hitting 47% from your three-point land. You didn't shoot as much as some of your teammates, but you did shoot well. Until that point, you mentioned Nick being he was a shooter, scorer. Were you used to being a facilitator, or were you used to being a scorer up until that point?
Well, that's interesting, and so sometimes people get confused a little bit about the difference between a score. So I scored 1,800 points in high school. Erwin Claggett scores 2,000 at St. Louis University. Andy scores 1,700 at UAB. I probably scored 800 or 900, did a lot of stuff with assists. But here's the thing. There's a difference between being a scorer and a shooter, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're a scorer, and the term, they throw around the term 3-level score. Okay, well, what does that mean? That means a guy that has range for a three-pointer, which, by the way, they have moved that three-point shot. My 47% was at 19 feet, right? Like, that was a lot closer than today. They moved that thing back. I think it's the international line. I think it's 21 feet. So they've moved it 2 feet back from what I played at. That's a tough shot. Yeah. I don't care who you are. That is a tough shot, right? I never shot one. Andy was shooting them from 2 feet beyond, but I never did, right? So that's a whole conversation in itself. But if you're a 3-level scorer, that means you can score off the dribble and you can finish at the rim. That's what a 3-level scorer was. Well, in high school, and you're playing kids that aren't all D1 kids, right?
Yeah.
So you can get to the rim. You're not facing 7-foot rim protectors, right? You're going to the rim against a 6'4" kid that played football, and he's not going to play college basketball. You can finish at the rim on that kid, right? Mm-hmm. Even a 6'6" kid. So when you get to college, D1 basketball at a high level, you're not finishing at the rim, right? There's just very few people that can finish at the rim. So what that leaves is the ability to hit a 21-foot three, which is difficult, and you're being closely guarded, right? The defense is so much more, the kids are more athletic, the intensity is higher, the defense is better, kids are getting after it. So, I probably only shot when I was open, right? Like, and then the other thing is a catch and shoot three. Like, I never shot a step back three, not 1 second. I wouldn't even thought about it, right? And kids, Jelly Walker shooting step back threes from the NBA range and they're going in, right? Mm-hmm. And he's being contested. It's amazing. I think Steve Mitchell could have done that too, by the way. He was that kind of player. But anyway, I get to UAB. At Michigan, they weren't sure what they were going to do with me, right? Mm-hmm. I was a combo guard. They're like, all right, play the point. And then, okay, you're going to play the two, right? Depending on matchups or depending on who's on the court, right? I get to UAB and you got Andy coming in from NC State. he's going to be our 2 guy, right? It's just, there's no question he's got that job, and he deserved it. He was the guy, right? Then at the point, then it just left me being at the point, right? And so that, yeah, Barry Bearden, who's great. That was my best friend at UAB. I love Barry. I'm not even talking about him, but he had such an impact on me, and we're still, great friends this day. I text him and talk to him and on the phone. And when I'm in Birmingham, he's down in Tampa right now, but we always get together. He's a great dad to his son, Nick. But Barry was great too. I mean, he was a great player. And so I'm like, okay, I'm not going to beat out Andy. I want playing time. I'm going to be a point guard, right? And I ended up being a pass first point guard. The reality is I wasn't Jelly Walker or Steve Mitchell. I was not going to create my own shot off the bounce. I needed some help, right? I needed some ball screens. I needed to come off screens, and we didn't really do that back then. So I became a facilitator, right? I became a dribbler. Don't turn the ball over. Get us into our offense. Pass the ball to the Andy Kennedys of the world or the Allen Hogs of the world, and play good defense. So that was the role that I ended up playing to get playing time, right? And then fortunately for me, was the coach is like, hey, we're going to go with a 3-card offense. So we had Barry, Andy, and me. And then you had Alan and Larry Rimbert. That was a pretty good group. That was my junior year. And to be honest, I was a better player my junior year because of Barry, really. He made me better because you certainly had to put a really good defender on Andy. And then if you didn't watch Barry, he could beat you off the dribble, and he could score off the dribble. So my junior year was kind of fun, to be honest with you. I could handle the ball. I could run the point. I didn't have a lot of, I could always go to Barry if I needed somebody to bail me out. Does that make sense? I had it pretty good, really. So that was a long answer to say, okay, and then let me land it. Are you ready, Will? I'll land it. So now, Nick, growing up, what do you want Nick Kramer to be? Well, I'll be honest. I didn't want him to be Jack Kramer. I wanted Nick to be Andy Kennedy, I wanted him to be a shooter. So we just worked on his shooting and his shooting and his shooting and his shooting. And what you learn when you get to college is when you're in high school, you can kind of be everything, right? Oh, I can go get 10 rebounds. Oh, I can defend this guy. Oh, I can play the post. I can play the point. But when you get to college, you have to have a job, right? You have to have a job. And Nick Kramer can win a job. He could win a job at SLU if he can shoot the crap out of it.
Yeah.
But he's got to be good. He's got to hit that open shot. Now he can't get scored on every single time, right? There has to be a certain level of competence, right? He has to have a certain level of athleticism. But if his skill of shooting threes is super high and he can make them at a pretty high clip, he'll get some playing time, right? Yeah. And then hopefully as he matures and gets older, can he expand his game to be a 2-level scorer and be able to score off the dribble, right? If you have a 30-second shot clock and you get the ball in your hands with 7 seconds to go on the clock, you got to put it on the, you got to put the ball on the court and make a play, make a move, and try to take 2 or 3 dribbles and score. Yeah. So hopefully he can do that, right? Like usually 18-year-old kids out of high school in this environment. I mean, if you look at SLU, and I'm sure Andy's doing it definitely at UAB for sure, but we've probably got 9 guys at SLU that are 22 to 24 years old. Okay, that's a big difference. And, an 18-year-old kid, to be honest, he's gone through puberty, but he's still somewhat of a boy, but a 22-year-old, 23-year-old, 24-year-old, those are men, right? And there's a big difference between a 23-year-old man and an 18-year-old kid that just came out of high school. So Nick's got an uphill battle, but, he's working hard. He's enjoying it. He's, but SLU's going to be pretty good this year. There's some people say they're top 30 team.
I saw that.
They're pretty good. And UAB is going to be good too. So I'm kind of disappointed. UAB came up and played SLU last year in St. Louis. That was great. I thought for sure we would do a home and home with them, and it didn't happen. But scheduling isn't hard.
I would have loved to have had a home and home with the Billikens. I always like playing them. I always like playing them in the old Conference USA. But
that was a great conference.
Yeah.
I think Nick and I were talking about that today. I mean, you had Cincinnati,
Mhm.
UAB, Memphis State, DePaul, SLU,
Louisville,
Louisville. Oh my God.
Marquette.
Marquette.
Keep going.
That might have been one of the best
Oh, I know.
conferences.
Mhm.
You know, you talk about it, Gene Bartow, and I have a box full of VHS tapes that just showed up on my doorstep here a few months ago. But I was a broadcasting major, and I interviewed Coach Bartow for one of my classes, and the class was about football, right? And in 1990, 1991, I think we had first year club football. And you know, you look at Gene. We haven't really talked about Gene, but you look at Gene Bartow. He was really ahead of his time. He was an innovator. He knew that for UAB to be successful, they had to have football. And really look at that. Look at our country. Look what's happening to the SEC and the Big 10 and the Big 12 and the Pac-12. I mean, and it ain't done, right?
Yeah, no,
it's
not.
amazing what's happening. And you really almost have to have football to survive, you know. I think there's going to be a small sliver of schools. I mean, you even look at Cincinnati, how good their football program is, right? But if you're basketball only, you're really in trouble, you know?
Yeah. And I hate that. I love a lot of basketball only schools like Butler. And well, I mean, I know Butler has an FCS program, but you know, it's not the same.
SLU's basketball.
DePaul
basketball only. Marquette's basketball only.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean,
yeah.
But those days are shrinking for those types of schools, you know.
Yeah.
That's what made the Big East so great. Like, you know, Villanova, Seton Hall, St. John's. Oh, yeah. Great conference back there too.
Yeah. Well, that first season at UAB, you guys made the NIT and you made a deep run in the NIT to the Final Four at Madison Square Garden in New York. The team that you had to beat to get there, that final step, was UConn on their home floor. I know you like you said in our talks this week, that was one game you really wanted to talk about. So how was that experience beating UConn?
Well, it was one of those games where, you know, you got to understand the NIT, right? The NIT doesn't have the money that the NCAA tournament does, right? It's gotten a little better. They propped it back up. They're trying to help make it survive. But back in those days, you know, Coach Bartow being our athletic director, we made the NIT. That was my first year at UAB. I think we won like 18 games at that point. We make the NIT, but then they would get with the athletic directors and they'd say, okay, who can guarantee the most money, right? So Coach Bartow would be like, all right. And that's the other thing. And I don't know if people, you know this as much, but those three teams that we were on, you know, that Andy and I were on back from 88 to 91, led UAB basketball in attendance. I think it was like 7,700 was our average, right? And think about that. That's a pretty good program, 30 years. And those three teams led the attendance. The other thing those three teams did, they averaged 80 points per game, right? And the only team to do that since is this year's team, averaged 80. And I'll be honest with you, I don't want to watch two teams wrestle and slug it out in a 52-51 defensive special. You know, like, I'm not going to pay to watch that. I am not paying, you know, right? Who would? But I'll watch somebody get up and down the court, make tough shots, defend, but give them some freedom. Let their guys push the ball up the floor. And when the guy's open, pull it up and let it fly, right? Yeah. And play good, hard defense. Yes, I'm not saying play, you know, as Gene called it, Olay defense and let somebody beat you off the dribble for a layup. But so I thought we put a pretty exciting brand of basketball on the court at UAB when I was there. I think Andy's doing it again now. So that was the first piece of that NIT run. Was we were like, okay, we want to host because we're going to put the most people out there. So I think we won the first game against Georgia Southern. Then we go up to Richmond. For some reason, they make us go on the road at Richmond, and we were kind of mad. They were a pretty good team. We win that game. So then UConn is the next game, and the winner gets to go to Madison Square Garden to the Final Four. And they had some conflict. They had not built their on-campus facility that's there now. That's beautiful. And for some reason, I think either the Boston Whalers or the Boston Celtics, somebody was playing in the Hartford Civic Center that night. So there was a conflict.
Mhm.
So we're like, okay, we'll bring them to Birmingham, right? But the NIT people were like, no, we don't want this team from Birmingham, Alabama to go to the Final Four. We want UConn, right? They're right up the street from New York, and they'll bring 5,000, 10,000 people down. So you can't really blame them. So they put us up there. We played on an on-campus. It was like a field house. It was like there was a track going around. It was horrible, to be honest with you. And then they wheeled in these stands, and there were 4,000 or 5,000 rabid college students, right? And they were right on the court, and they were East Coast aggressive, rude. Like it was a fun environment, to be honest with you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we go up there, and of course, Andy played his ass off. I think he had like 17 points. He made some big shots. But the defining moment of that game was a play where, and I'll never forget this as long as I live, where early in the game, there was like an offensive rebound. The ball bounces off. Reginald Turner, who got drafted by the Utah Jazz, I think played a couple years in the NBA, was super athletic and 6'8" and strong and could jump, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he caught like an offensive rebound. He cocked it behind his head and he came down and dunked it. And he missed the dunk, hits the back of the rim. The ball flies all the way to half court and he completely moves the rim. He didn't break the rim. He didn't pull it all the way down. And the looks on the UConn players' faces, because to be honest, I think they kind of viewed us as a bunch of country bumpkins, right? Like, who are these hillbillies from Alabama, coming up here to play us? We're UConn, we're great. And they ended up being pretty good. That they had a great run after that. But, it was pretty fun watching their faces like, we're in for a dogfight. Like, these guys we're not going to back down, right? We're gonna punch them in the mouth and they're going to punch us right back. Like, I don't want to hear about your Big East, this or that. We're coming up and we whipped them, we beat them. And it was a great, like, I don't know. And I didn't really play that good. I was really struggling at that time. Really, Barry played great. Barry was probably the best point guard in America at that time. Like, we went to the Final Four. We lost to St. John's, which that was a whole nother story. I'm not going to go into that. And then we beat Michigan State. And then Barry was like voted one of the top players. And then him and Andy got to go and travel Europe. The NIT, a bunch of guys from New York put this thing on, and those guys went to Europe. And Andy said this to me, not Barry. Andy goes, Jack, Barry was probably the best point guard in all of Europe that summer. He was really good. Wow. So that was kind of a fun, you asked me to remember some games, but that was kind of a fun game just because we had no fans there. And they just thought for sure they were going to beat us, and they thought we were a bunch of country bumpkins, which in a way, one of the things that was great about Coach Bartow, he brought in really good people, like Alan Ogg, Larry Rembert, Barry Bearden, Dylan Howard, Carter Long, Andy Kidd, really, and probably the worst guy in the bunch was me, they were just all really good guys, and people that you could be friends with your whole life. So really, and then that went before we got there too, right? Steve Mitchell and McKinley Singleton, he was great. Oh, all those guys. They're just a bunch of good guys. Tracy Foster. I'm still friends with his brother, Shook Foster. In fact, he texted me earlier saying, "Hey, how can I listen to the podcast? Send me the link." So anyway, it's just a good group of people. Really was.
Well, that's a great segue into our next question. In your remaining 2 seasons at UAB, you guys made it to the NCAA tournament the next season and then the NIT in your final season. Those teams had a ton of offensive firepower. You've already name dropped a ton of the guys. You played with some of the all-time greats from that era. How often do you stay in touch with some of your former teammates?
Well, like I keep mentioning Andy, of course, he's the head coach at UAB now. So, and he's in it, right? Him and Dylan are both Division I head coaches. And, you live through them a little bit vicariously, right? Like I remember in high school, my dream was to be a college basketball coach, right? And even in college a little bit too. So of course you got those guys. You got Barry Bearden, who, I stay in touch with, talk all the time with. His son Nick is the same age, a little bit younger than my Nick, but in high school, which is pretty cool. And when I'm down in Birmingham with John's baseball, I'd go watch Nick play basketball. It was a lot of fun. And then, of course, Carter Long. I was a senior. He was a freshman. Carter's got a couple twins that are really good basketball players. And then Carter was in Winfield, and then they decided to move up to Sikeston, Missouri, which is a couple hours south of St. Louis. So, in fact, Carter will call, and he's kind of a little bit connected to the St. Louis basketball scene, being a couple hours south. His one son went to SEMO and played Division I for a little bit. He's transferred down to Missouri Southern in Joplin. Mm-hmm. And then his other son, and they both started out in Maryville, but his son went and played some D1 basketball up at Youngstown State, but then he's decided to go finish it up at Emporia State, which is a great Division II school, maybe one of the best in the nation. They've won a lot of national championships. So I stay in touch with Carter. We've lost Alan Ogg, of course. I loved Alan back, when Alan would play with the Miami Heat in the NBA. I would go down and visit and stay with him. And then he played for the Milwaukee Bucks. I was living in Chicago at the time, and I would go up and hang out with him. And we lost Alan, and he was such a gentle soul and such a good person. And it was really sad. He had a heart ailment there, and it was just horrible. And of course, Larry Rimbert, we lost him as well. There's a picture. I know you don't have the video going, but I have a picture of all of us back there, and I love that. And we lost two of them. And that's one thing Andy always says. Life is short, and that's life, bro. He always says that. Like, I'll be like, gosh, this happened bad with the kids. That's life, bro. You just got to deal with it. You just got to keep going. But it's just a good group. I loved it. I really enjoyed Birmingham. It's interesting. Like, my daughter's at University of Missouri, and then John is down at Oxford at Ole Miss. And those are two beautiful campuses, right? Mm-hmm. But Oxford's like 30,000 people, and I think Columbia's maybe 70 or 80. I love Birmingham. Like, it was 1 million people. To be honest, I probably should have went somewhere bigger. I needed a little bit bigger town, but and Nick is going to SLU. So I told that to Nick, because he was like, Dad, I'm not going to have the same college experience that John and Emma are having. And that's true. You're not, but it's a different experience, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I love the south side of Birmingham. I love, Highland Golf Course. I can't think of what the name is, but I lived across the street there. And we had so much fun hanging out there, 5 Points South, all the different bars and stuff. I probably spent too much time. That's another thing. Why did you end up being a facilitator? Well, Andy was in there working on his shot, and I was down at the bar having a beer. But Birmingham's a great town, and I really enjoyed it. But it was a good experience, and then boy, it's really grown and changed. That campus is phenomenal.
Oh yeah,
just gorgeous what they've done with it. So it's good stuff.
All right, Jack. Well, I've got a couple of questions from social media. Some of them I know that we talked about with some of your friends or reached out to it. But one of the first ones that I really wanted to go over was a question from Steve Rutherford on Facebook. He said, ask Jack about the crowds at Bowling Green. He was great at taunting them. And Steve's obviously referring to the Western Kentucky fans. Is it true that you needed a police escort out of the gym after one of your games?
First of all, Steve's got a pretty good memory, and I followed him on social media, and it's amazing some of the statistical stuff he comes up with. So he does a great job out there. He's a huge UAB fan and supporter, and we love that. And yes, it is true that I did need a police escort out of Western Kentucky, the Hilltoppers. And, I think back to that time and that era, right? And you and I were talking the other day about how the Tennessee volunteer baseball team, and a kid ran around and kind of gave the figure, and I was laughing about that. And I'm just thinking about if John would do something like that on this. And I'm going to tell you, first of all, I would not want him to do that, right? Yeah. And I'm going to tell you, Coach Bianco would not settle for that for 1 second, right? Like, this, not even a millisecond would he allow that, right? If it did, I can imagine what he would do to John, and I would be in full support of that, right? However, as a child, I probably would have been better suited over at Tennessee, right? And then the other thing is like the coaches, right? You think of Gene Bartow, Clean Gene, so you probably think of him more like a Coach Bianco, but really looking back, Coach Bartow was probably more like Tony Vitello, right? So what happened was we get up there and they had a good crowd, maybe 10 or 12,000. They loved basketball up there and they were pretty good. They weren't great at that time, but they were still drawing pretty well, and their fans were into it. They were well coached. And in the game, it was I can't remember. I think it might have been my sophomore year, to be honest, or maybe my junior. I can't remember, but it was anyway. So I went down and I actually scored a couple baskets early in the game, right? Like I came down and I think I had like 3 quick baskets, And so I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to do a heat check, right? I'm going to come down and do another one. I come down off the dribble, pull up, and I land on, I missed the shot, but I landed on one of the defender's foot and I rolled my ankle pretty bad. And I'd had some ankle issues throughout going back to high school. So, oh my gosh. I mean, I just went down, I screamed. I'm like, the play had to stop. They had to carry me off the court. Right. Like, it was just looked horrible. And I probably screamed in a way that would make people think I broke my ankle. Right. So we go back into the trainer, Dave Halsey. Yeah. So go back with Dave, get back in there. And he's like, what's going on? I go, well, don't cut the tape off. Cause if you cut the tape off, I'm done. Right. Like it'll just blow up. So he's like, what do you want me to do? I'm like, well, just tape it down like a cast, So he just, it was so tight. He just taped it down as tight as he could make it. And then I put my shoe back on. I'm kind of limping around and back in the locker room. He's like, what do you think? I'm like, I don't know. So I go back out and there's maybe 5 minutes left in the first half. And I sit down next to Gene and he's like, what's going on? I go, well, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make it, but if you don't put me in now, I won't be able to play in the second half because it'll just stiffen up. It's already starting to stiffen up. So I'm going to hobble a little bit, but just put me back in and let me kind of hobble around a little bit. And that could get the blood flowing to the point where I'll sustain it through the rest of the day. Right. He's like, okay. He puts me in. Well, when I go in and I'm kind of hobbling around, the fans start booing me. I'm like, why are you booing me? Like, I'm really trying to suck it up here for my team. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no reason to boo me, So they kept it up and it kind of bugged me a little bit, and then I'd catch the ball and the whole place would boo. And then I'd pass it and they wouldn't, right? I'm like, what is wrong with these people, So here's the thing, people who say, oh, they don't hear the crowd. Well, of course you hear the crowd, that's what's great about basketball. You're in shorts and a little, a small shirt. Football, you're separated, right? You don't hear the crowd in football, right? You're separated. But in basketball, it's intimate, they're right there on you. And it's one thing I love about basketball, right? So, okay, it's pissing me off. And I'm like playing to them a little bit, which I shouldn't have done. But I catch the ball and I'm like, put my hand up to my ear, and I pass, whatever. Well, back and forth. Well, now we get the ball, 15 seconds to go. It's the far end of the court. Our locker room is at the complete other end. I'm in the corner. The ball goes around, works around, comes back to me, 5, 4, 3, 2. I shoot a 3 and I make it at the buzzer of the first half, right? And as I'm running down the court to go into our locker room, I run the entire length of the court, giving them the finger. Now, Coach Bartow did not see that, right? But they went insane. Like their fans were pissed. So then we end up winning the game and we go in the locker room and in come 2 state troopers and they're like, Coach Bartow, we have to give Jack a police escort. He won't make it out of this gym, And to Coach Bartow's credit, he loved that kind of stuff, to be honest with you, And he was laughing. And the next year, he's like, oh, Lord. He goes, I kind of like it, to be honest with you. They hate me at Bowling Green, but they hate Jack Kramer even more, And that, so it's kind of odd, you think about that with Gene. His nickname was Clean Gene. He was a nice guy. He got along with everybody. But there was a side of him that he was okay with it, Does that make sense? It's
Yeah.
funny. So that's what happened. And then, I don't know. I was gonna, if the name, image, likeness existed, I was gonna sell T-shirts, the next year. But if I would have sold I was gonna make them kind of negative towards me, and then my roommate was gonna go up there and sell T-shirts, but my dad and another guy, Charlie Campbell, got to me and stopped me, which thankfully they did, because I would have been eligible, because you're not allowed to do that. Now you can, right?
Yeah.
Back then. So Steve, that was the Bowling Green, but you think about that, like there was a fight. Was it Old Dominion or VCU?
It was Old Dominion. Yeah.
Old Dominion from before I got there, but there were chairs being thrown and punches being thrown, but you can't do that anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe you shouldn't, but it was it was crazy back in those days. Part of me likes it. I'm not gonna lie. I do enjoy that kind of thing. So.
Well, one of my other social media questions comes from Martin Coffey on Facebook. He asked, ask Jack if Andy ever passed the ball back.
No. It's pretty funny. Andy had 1,800 points, and I don't think he had 5 assists. No, but here, all right. In fairness, back to Andy, Barry and I talked about that. We were working hard to get each other the ball, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'll back up, and I'm probably going deeper than this. I should, but I was having a conversation with Mike Hanks, and you asked me earlier how I ended up at UAB. Well, a legendary high school coach at Quincy. I didn't play for him, but his name was Cheryl Hanks. He had a son. His son actually went to SMU out of high school, didn't play a lot there, but loved basketball, wanted to be a coach, ended up at Indiana as a grad assistant, was at Ole Miss as an assistant coach, got the Stanford job, was one of the youngest coaches in the history of the NCAA tournament at that time in the 70s, late 70s, and took Stanford to the NCAA tournament. First time ever Stanford ever gone to the NCAA tournament. Mike Hanks took them. Then he parlayed that and got the South Alabama job. Okay. Well, he lost his job at South Alabama and he ends up at UAB, right? And that's how I ended up at UAB. Just that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm all right, I'm leaving Michigan. I took a visit to Missouri, took one to Texas, took one to Iowa State. I wasn't even, I'll be honest, part of me wasn't even thinking, I was like, I might even not even play basketball anymore. And then my dad called Mike and said, man, I'm worried about Jack. I don't think he's going to play anymore, right? And Mike goes, let me get a hold of him and I'll get him down here to Birmingham. I think he'll like it here, and boom, that's how I ended up. So Mike and I were talking this week back and forth, and he's like, I thought you could have done well on a high ball screen situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I could have, but if you're running an offense, whatever it is, that offense has to have some plays designed to help get the players open, right?
Yeah.
And whether they're off ball screens or ball screens or something. And we didn't do a lot of that at UAB, to be honest with you. There wasn't a lot of structure on
mm-hmm.
the offense. There was a little bit, but it just was what it was. It wasn't, and we didn't have a lot of it at Michigan either, to be honest with you. And so for a guy like me, I just wasn't going to beat somebody off the dribble and score, right?
Yeah.
I didn't have it in me. But you could have given me a little help, or if somebody would have penetrated and kicked the ball out, But to answer, no. But Andy's job was to shoot,
mm-hmm.
okay? And my job as the point guard, I'll be honest, I didn't want Andy passing the ball. I wanted Andy to shoot it. And if I gave Andy the ball, he better shoot it. I mean, and that was my job, and that was his job. And he gets the glory, but you deserve the glory. Trust me. Because if you don't make those, it's harder to make the shots than to pass the ball.
Mm-hmm.
And if he doesn't make the shots, we don't win.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't make the shots and we don't win, it's his fault. Right?
Yeah.
So you get the glory, but you also get the blame.
Mm-hmm.
It's just part of the territory.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with being a head basketball coach. I mean, Nick's like, he loves seeing Andy in those cool shoes and that, sport coat with Charles Barkley, right? Hey, that's the fun part, right? Hey, he's having a good time being a college basketball coach. The tough part is, out recruiting, dealing with losses, dealing with the media, getting fired. It's going to happen. You stay in the business long enough, you're going to get fired. So you take the good with the bad. But Andy's job was to score, and my job was to pass. So no, Andy did not pass much, but I didn't hold it against him.
The next question comes from John Potts at John Potts 45 on Twitter. He asks, how many dirty 30s did his high school coach make him run?
Well, John is a friend of mine, and I know John. John is at Quincy University, which they have a really good Division II basketball program. And John is familiar with my high school basketball coach. And as I mentioned earlier, his name was Jerry Leggett, and he ran an incredible program. And part of the lore of Coach Leggett was really hard practices. And he had a thing called the Dirty 30, which it was a collection of 13 drills. And if you did all of the drills properly, you could be done in 30 minutes, thus the name Dirty 30. But he would use those collection of 13 drills as punishment or conditioning or different things. And literally, he could make that drill, those collection of 13 drills, last 3 hours. And he did occasionally. And then practice would start. So you do those drills for 2 hours, and you had to wear ankle weights and chest weights. Some players, you didn't have to wear both. Like I wore chest weights, some players wore ankle weights. And then after those drills, you had 4 minutes to take, your ankle weights or your chest weights off. You had 4 minutes to get a drink of water, and you had to be back out on the court. But if one person wasn't back out on the court, you started over. So he was old school. He was so hard. Nobody liked him, but you loved him after. Like I love him now. Does that make sense? He passed away, but he used to say, "I treat everybody the same." Bad, right? But and that's a whole conversation around coaching. That old school. Dads were kind of like that. Dads didn't say "I love you" to your kids back in the 50s and 40s, right? Now they might say it too much, right? Like Coach Leggett was over here. He never told you he loved you. He was super hard on you. So he used the Dirty 30. Running was his favorite way to punish you. Like you just ran, but you were in shape. It was definitely old school.
The next one, the last social media question comes from Dr. Z at Aaron R. Zalis on Twitter. He has a couple of questions for you. He says, Woodford or Jack, ice cubes or ice ball, and what did you learn about yourself during COVID?
Well, first of all, Dr. Z, Aaron Zalis, played basketball for Coach Leggett, right? We went to the same, he graduated in 1979 from high school. I graduated in 1986. His brother Doug and I were great friends, from kindergarten all the way through college and into Chicago. And then the last few years, Aaron is a superintendent or retired superintendent down in Rolla School District, which is maybe an hour and a half from St. Louis. And so Aaron is a great educator. His children played basketball and did well, and he had a great career in education. And so the last few years, we kind of reconnected, and I think it might have been over COVID because he was a superintendent, and I was really frustrated with how COVID was being handled as everybody else was. And I'm like, why are they doing this? And Aaron was my kind of sounding board, like, hey, why are they doing things a certain way? Well, through that process, we'd always been friends, but the age gap, we weren't buddies. Well, through texting and on the phone and different things, we got to be good friends. Well, one day I just was drinking beer, and I said, man, I just can't drink beer anymore. And he said, you should switch over to bourbon. And I'm like, oh my Lord, I'm not ready for bourbon. Well, then he's like, so I'm like, all right, which one should I go get? Well, he would recommend, Elijah, Craig, or Woodford Reserve Double Oak, so all these different brands. Well, then I said, man, I used to drink that Jack Daniels when I was in college, so that's what definitely Woodford Reserve Double Oak is a great bourbon. And then Aaron and I don't like a bunch of loose ice cubes, right? Like a whole glass full in a shot. I don't like that at all. So I was on the phone there and I'm like, God, I was at this bar and they had a big cube and it was great, but I want that for home. And he goes, hey, I just went on Amazon. I got one. So he gave me that. So I ordered it, came back, and we're taking pictures back and forth. I'm like, oh my God, this is great. So then the last thing was COVID. COVID really saved Nick in a lot of ways. Like, it was horrible from a recruitment standpoint, but Nick was home. They weren't going to school and they weren't playing basketball. And man, he just improved like crazy during that time. So even though COVID was really bad and we're still feeling the effects of that, but in a way, it allowed us to slow down a little bit, right, and spend some more time as a family and stuff. So there were some positive things that came out of it.
Well, I got a couple more questions for you. So when you look back on your UAB career, how do you view it, and how do you hope that you are remembered?
Well, I'll start back with the transfer portal, right? So if you're Jameis Williams and you are a 5-star recruit out of Cardinal Ritter High School in St. Louis, Missouri, and you go to Ohio State, and if you don't transfer, nobody remembers Jameis Williams, right? I don't even know if he's going to go to the NFL if he stays there, because maybe he doesn't get on the field. He transfers to Alabama. He has incredible success. I contend if he doesn't hurt his knee in that game, they beat Georgia. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's the ultimate for a kid that transfers, right? Like, mm-hmm. So for me, yeah, like my dream was to go to UAB, start for 3 years, score 2,000 points, take UAB to the NCAA tournament, go to the Final Four. Like, how great would that have been? But it didn't happen, right? Yeah. And then you got to understand, as an athlete, like Gene Bartow said this to me one time. We were walking in, they had a 25-year reunion with coach wasn't even the coach then. It was, oh Lord, I can't think of the guy's name. I can't believe it. But anyway, we were walking in, and it was the guy that followed Murray from Arkansas.
Mike Anderson.
Mike Anderson.
Yeah.
Yep. And Mike did a nice job, invited everybody back. And to Coach Bartow's credit, he went. And we were walking in, and he was nervous. And I said, Coach, what's wrong? And he goes, well, he said, Jack, there's very few people who play college basketball who are satisfied with their career. And that's kind of sad, really, when you look back on that, because, but even like a guy who maybe scored a lot of points, but he thought he should have went to the NBA. Mm-hmm. Felt like the coach didn't help him, right? Or are you following me? Or yeah. You look at Jack Kramer, who started for 3 years, has a lot of assist records, like played on good teams. You should come away feeling really good about that. Mm-hmm. But you don't. Unfortunately, you don't. And that's the majority of people, unfortunately. But you should, right? Because what happens is you have a loss like to UCLA, and it hurt. And for 10 or 15 years, I couldn't watch the NCAA tournament until Nick came along, right? And Nick's coach kind of helped me this year, because there's a kid from St. Louis named Caleb Love who plays for North Carolina, and he had a wonderful tournament. And he competed against Nick in conference, a high school called CBC. He's a great player. And North Carolina wouldn't been to the Final Four. North Carolina wouldn't have had the season they had if it wasn't for Caleb. Mm-hmm. He had a rough game in that championship. And Nick's coach Erwin Claggett, went and helped Caleb, right? Mm-hmm. And what Coach Claggett said to Caleb was, these games make us who we are, but they don't define who we are. And he said that to me on the phone, and I'm 55 years old. And I'm like, holy smokes. Like, where were you when I was 25, right? Because you lose to UCLA, and it's part of your experience. It's part of, it makes you who you are, but it doesn't define you. Okay, let's say we would have beat them and gone to the final. Does it make you a better person? No, right? So, like, I look back on my career, I don't think about, even though we talked about going to the Final Four of the NIT or making the NCAA tournament, I think about Barry Bearden, Dylan Howard, Andy Kennedy, Alan Ogg, Carter Long. Like, I think about those guys, and I don't really think about the wins and losses. I think about the friendships, the relationships, and then it's off the court too. Like there's a guy named Mark Freeman who's a great friend of mine, David Wardis, Charlie and Betty Campbell and their family. And so, but sometimes it's hard to see that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, and so and then it takes you until you have children to really appreciate what you were able to do. So I played hard. I gave it everything I had. I was a good teammate. I wanted to win. I was competitive. I would have done some things differently. I think we all would if we look back on our time in life. But I enjoyed my time at UAB, and I'm proud of it. And really, like, people will ask me, I am a UAB Blazer. I don't even think of myself as that I didn't even care about going to Michigan. Like, to me, I didn't even think about it. I love UAB. I love that Andy's doing great. I follow the football team. I love that our baseball team is we got a great coach. That guy was awesome at Stanford. He's going to turn the program around. You mark my words. I guarantee you UAB makes the NCAA tournament in 3 years. Promise you. And I just think Birmingham's a great city. It really is. It's a wonderful city, and I really enjoyed my time there.
Last question: How can my listeners engage with you now?
Well, David Wardis, my friend, said, "Be careful. You want to be careful. At the engagement level." That was a joke. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but I'm out on Twitter. I enjoy Twitter. I don't know what my Twitter handle is, but I think if you Google Jack Kramer Twitter, it would probably come up. You and I are out there on there together. I like Twitter. I think it's fun. I don't like get involved in the crazy side of things, but I do like to watch that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But I use Twitter for like my son's sports and stuff, and my daughter's stuff, stuff with her. But I do like Instagram. It's funny. I don't typically like social media. I'm new to social media. I do not like Facebook. I think there's so many downsides to social media, but there's just no getting away from it. And there's so many values to it as well. This is one of them. It's a lot of fun. You're doing a great job. This is a forum for you to advocate your support for UAB's athletics and sport that, 10 years ago, that wasn't a forum or a venue that would be available. So there's a lot of value in social media, but those are the two places. I like Twitter, so, hey, I almost always follow back no matter what, but I'll be honest, I'm kind of, because I'm getting away from it a little bit. I don't know why, but I'm starting to get away from Twitter. So that's where I'm at. That's all I got.
Well, Jack, I really appreciate it. I learned a ton, and I know my listeners are going to really enjoy the trip down memory lane. So thank you so much for not only your time as a Blazer and all you did on the court, but everything off the court. And thank you so much for supporting them, and congrats to your son on the national championship, and your son now at SLU, and your daughter and everything. So it was great catching up with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Will. Great job.
Thank you. Go Blazers.
Go Blazers.
All right. I want to thank Jack so much for all his amazing stories and getting to talk to him a lot off the air. I feel like I learned a lot about him, and I really appreciate all he did for UAB basketball and all the friendships he made. It's great to see that he's still friends with a lot of his former teammates, and it's great to see that his kids are doing well and excelling in all of their fields, be it sports or academics. So congrats to you, Jack, and thank you so much for joining, and thank you for listening. Be sure to check out my social pages at Dragons Den EFEL on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and check out my countdown to kickoff. Just a little over a month until football season. See guest announcements for future upcoming episodes, and stay in the know for UAB sports. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Good night, and go Blazers.